When Canadian Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire commanded United Nations forces during the genocide in Rwanda, few beyond the military were aware of the severe psychological damage that witnessing such moral atrocities can cause. Dallaire's revelation that he suffered from PTSD and moral injury in the Rwandan conflict helped destigmatize these potentially devastating mental conditions among military veterans. It also helped us understand how all of us can experience moral injury in our daily lives. As we live through the aftershocks of a global pandemic, racial injustice, and the rise of extremist violence around the world, there's no better time to have a conversation about trauma, recovery, and moral courage. How do we build resilience, collective hope? How can we embrace humanity and human connection? Join the conversation as we work together to build upon General Dallaire's call for transformative change and an engaged approach to leadership in the face of moral dilemmas.
Welcome or welcome back. In the fall of 2021, Cleveringa Professor Romeo Dallaire and world experts shared their thoughts about PTSD, children's rights, war crimes, humanitarian law, and peacekeeping in a series of conversations about leadership and moral dilemma during times of conflict and crisis. How do leaders sustain moral codes in times of adversity? How do they cope with the impact of war on the battlefield, in UN leadership, in criminal courts, and at home? How do leaders find repair following moral injury? In these sessions, prominent speakers elaborated on topics covered in the Cleveringa lecture that Romeo Dallaire gave on the 26th of November 2020.
We went through a whole bunch of incredible topics, Eric. We heard beginning in September on moral leadership and courage from different perspectives. We had on September 29th, the cost of leadership and moral courage. September 30th, we heard about ethical decision-making and moral dilemmas. On October 13th, on moral injury and intergenerational trauma. October 14th, we heard about the repair of moral injury. October 27th, we came back to hear about destigmatizing the impact of trauma and PTSD, and then followed on October 28th, Re-Envisioning Leadership, before we closed our series on November 10th with the pathway forward.
In the introductory of all this, General Romeo Dallaire has been sharing his experience as a moral leader and a decision maker during the Rwandan genocide. The panelists that we invited for this session reflected on moral leadership and courage and its impact on individuals and communities. And for this special session, we want to thank the participants and the moderator.
We heard particularly from moderator Dr. Shelley Whitman and speakers General Retired Romeo Dallaire, Professor Dr. Hester Bale, Professor Dr. Bill Flanagan, Michael Cicquanini, Major General Retired Patrick Camart, all offered their unique insights and thoughts about leadership.
And thanks for the opening to both rectors, Suzette, Hester Bell, and Bill Flanagan opened the webinar series. So thank them for sharing their thoughts and welcoming us.
Absolutely. It was wonderful in that first session to actually have all three of the institutes that we're honoring and pulling together, combining our efforts to actually run the series. So most centrally, Leiden University, as you've together celebrated for the 50th time the Cleveringa lecture series.
It was great that the Dallaire Institute also partnered with us. The three institutions really equally contributed to this webinar series.
Absolutely. Most centrally, the Leiden University with the Cleveringa professorship, and this being the 50th one that Romeo Dallaire
Yeah.
received. And then with certainly with the Dallaire Institute, joining with them to partner for this series, and the University of Alberta being able to contribute in such a meaningful way to support the bringing of this webinar series to fruition.
And the beauty, Suzette, also is that we had people from various disciplines, various ranks, military, academic, mental health, law, as we said in the beginning, North and the South, people from different colors, different sexes, leaders. So the blend was really wonderfully represented. And what I found very rewarding, that we were being represented by so many countries across the globe. It was 26 up to 36 countries that were represented when we gave our webinar series.
Yeah, and the number of viewers who would stay for the whole series, not just during the time that we were running it, but knowing that too the series is going to be permanently on the Leiden website, so that people can go back and view again if they wish, spread the news about the series, and also read the transcripts if they so desire, so that they can circle back, review, refresh themselves about some of the key content that was shared. We had a lot of very incredible, rich topics that were discussed.
And not to forget the preparation by the student engagements. We had 3 student engagement settings where we blended students from University of Alberta and Leiden University in a session with Romeo Dallaire, where they could fire questions at him from various angles. And we all were there. It was wonderful to see how incentivizing these sessions were for each of these students.
Yeah, they were rich conversations and very inspiring. So many of our students ended up talking about how memorable those occasions were, where they had a chance to speak with the general face to face and ask whatever they wanted, really, of such an incredible leader who's had rich, strong leadership experiences, but also has gone through his own struggles and his journey towards post-traumatic growth as he's worked through issues.
I remember that I myself had also the opportunity to fire a question at him about how this sort of this poetic quote that he rehearsed on the shaking hands with the devil, where the general said, "What I cannot stand is the loudness of silence." Well, this was recorded 25 years ago. So the question was, how is that now for you? So we elaborated on that in these student engagement settings, and students could reflect on that, what it meant for him to be reflecting on that now.
Yeah, a very powerful metaphor. It really highlighted, I think, the humanity of who he is, just the human being, and him in his role, him in his leadership role, what he faced, what he saw, the struggles that he had, and then the impact and how it's the residue that it's left within him, and how it's affected his very being, and at times his will to live or not. And then his journey towards recovery. It also really highlighted for me some of the central points that he made in his opening comments when he spoke at it, when he was initially given the Cleveringa professorship. And those 3 salient points we saw arise during the student engagement, but also during the webinar series, those things that we circled back on repeatedly. He spoke a lot about embracing humanity. And in that time when we engaged with the students, he really showed his own humanity as well as the humanity of those he served, the teams he led, his comrades, and those under his charge. So embracing humanity. And then we also heard a lot about engaged leadership and what that leadership really meant, and the seriousness with which one takes on that role, that responsibility. And then the third thing that we heard was so much about culture change, and certainly in the student engagement, the general was certainly inviting the younger generation to step forward, a real strong call to action about how they can make transformative change in their world, and then looking forward in terms of our current context, what things we need to do to look at in terms of our world cultures, our Canadian culture here, certainly in the Netherlands, across the globe, how we can create a culture where humanity is truly embraced.
And the general also reached out, as he often said, to the generation without borders.
Absolutely.
And we reflected on that. That's the generation that is now in their 20s, 30s, who are going to become potential leaders of the future.
Exactly. And a real invitation for them to use all the tools at their disposal. So the real way that media, social media can really be used to leverage their vision forward to create a new world.
And what you just said again, I thought that was also the highlight in part. There were many highlights, but transformative culture change and the plan to action is some of the discourse that has to change for sustainable peace.
Exactly.
Right. There was across many sessions was something that came back over and over. Sustainable peace and that transformative change in sort of a masculine discourse, if I may use that word, to another discourse that we may have to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, that has multiple voices and multiple ways of viewing what leadership actually looks like. I think the other thread that kind of wove throughout surprised me, didn't surprise me. It was around moral compass. And
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah, it was. It popped up in many of the conversations, and where each one of us receives our values, our morals, and what guides us when we make those decisions in any roles that we hold in our lives, in formal leadership roles, but also in our families, in our communities. And so that moral compass and how important that is for us to be aware of it, to be attuned to it, and to know when it goes off center, and how we can recenter again, and the injuries that can be caused when it goes off center, and the novel kinds of interventions that are needed to actually be able to support people as they go through those injuries.
When to say it in like plain terms, when shit hits the fan,
yeah,
what has been feeding your moral compass? And often what we heard a panelist say, that it was sort of these early memories, what they've learned in their critical childhood years that mattered, that really sort of served as the moral compass to have actions that were based on that moral compass that was very early rooted in their upbringing. Not so much, or maybe additionally, what they've learned later in life in their training when it kicked in. But it was obvious that many times they referred to what they've been learning from their fathers and mothers during their critical times as children.
It was interesting in light of that comment, where there are intergenerational traumas, how does that impact things? And how does one's moral compass get impacted by the stress and strains that different generations, for various reasons, have experienced? Leaders who maybe have in military leaders who may have come back and sustained injuries, and how that flows over into family life. Or when we heard from the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation here, the first Canadian one, in the Canadian context, giving some consideration to the residential schools and the injuries that were sustained in that, how that rolls over, but not just that, thinking about immigrants and refugees and people coming into our cultures from various wartime experiences or distressing experiences, and how that carries forward intergenerationally.
When you're saying that there's so many of these vignettes in these webinar series, when the panelists were talking about some of their personal experiences, and we tried to generalize those to wider stories, but they stood out as exemplifications of something that I wish to put forward. And there are many. Dalila Opikuku, she stands out on one hand, but there were so many others that shared their personal vignettes that really served the purpose to highlight critical elements. It just came to my mind to share that.
I think what really stood out for me in that, someone like Dallaire Pikachu, thinking of her early life experience, but then also her choice. So the experiences that she had, how that affected her moral choices, her moral compass, and how she exercised her will to be able to seek help when she had, so that she didn't carry forward some of the injuries that could have been sustained otherwise. The anger that she felt, for example, about some of the things that she had been exposed to in her professional service as an adjudicator related to the residential schools.
It was an important day, September 30th, for us as organizers also to kind of embrace how that day was going to be respected. First day for Canada for Truth and Reconciliation, and me being a military psychiatrist from another country. But though I think we tried to respect that first day by blending it to residential school survivors, the topic of Indigenous people. So I hope that came across well.
I think it did. I think it also was highlighted again on the last session when we had the Honorable Senator Marie Sinclair come back and wed those two, integrate those two concepts about the value of embracing humanity truly, and call to action going forward related to the civilian society, the residential schools, different circumstances that we face that beg a question around how do we respond.
And what the general said there was also a call to action. Somewhere embedded into his notes, he said, we need to give these people their language back. I thought that was really a call to action where I felt like, oh, this is not the last time that we're going to hear about that.
Yeah, there's such an incredible call to language and identity. We heard a lot about identity and how people's identity gets compromised either by the loss of language or experiences where they might be morally compromised or otherwise. So there's that whole piece. I think that there is a lot of conversation related to a call to action going forward. How do we give people respect and dignity and embrace humanity for everyone? And what does that actually mean?
The very last session was very touching also about the call to a moral code that was articulated there. And it's a very simple word on respect. And it was highlighted by some of the panelists there. And it echoed actually through many of the sessions. And when you're referring to moral compass and respect, where that's being taught, and how that is of really of survival value for, as we call for sustainable peace, how we can incorporate that into our humanities, and how we can get that code back in our military communities and many of our professional organizations as well.
Yeah, and I think with that, there's the reflection on how does someone get their compass if they don't have a rooting in a particular family or a particular set of values. How do they name it? And also how do cultures return to a better way of being, a new way of being, a returning to what could be, ought to be, in order to embrace humanity. And we think about the military sexual trauma, for example, that we're hearing right now, and how do cultures such as the militaries that are experiencing various realities face truth, and then how do we reconcile with that, and how do we pave a new path forward, and build on people's strengths, but also be authentic in standing in truth and giving that space and time before we move into the time of reconciliation. And we heard that within various contexts within the military, but also within the Indigenous communities and other groups that have gone through a lot of struggles.
I'm echoing something that I want to articulate in this sort of evaluation. Was it Michel Chikwanini? Or am I mixing up his name now with another one that said I was eating bullets for breakfast? When we were talking about leaders and how good leaders needed to be engaged leaders, but there's also leaders that taken the wrong path. And he said, I grew up with leaders that actually weren't the role models for many people. And I'm just echoing that because it was one of the quotes, eating bullets for breakfast, that he elaborated on. Some of these touching quotes, and as I said earlier, and we're remembering these personal vignettes. There were beautifully elaborated, I must say, in many of the contributions that we had.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of seminal moments that that I look forward to actually us being able to do an analysis of all of the student engagements we had, but also the webinars themselves, and look forward to pulling out those key themes that we heard across all of the discussions, because they bubble to the top, they rise to the top: moral compass, moral courage, moral injury, moral repair. And then the re-mending, looking at reconciliation, forgiveness, different kinds of means of reconnecting after injuries have happened, a call to action, leadership, what it takes to actually be a leader, how we help form leaders, how we help prepare leaders for what they may face in the realities of service, and what they might need to do in order to recover after such experiences.
Suzette, in this wrapping up, I must tell you that it was wonderful to work with you to make this event so memorable. And even though we're very distant, thank you for working along those lines here that we've walked together.
Yeah, it's been an absolute privilege. Certainly a rich experience and a learning experience. Has been an honor, truly, Eric.
And it's great to have been able to do this for General Romeo Dallaire, to leverage his professorship. And it's been a wonderful year, I think, for him to look back on. It's been very productive with all the engagements that he's had with us and the students and the panelists and the preparatory sessions and everything, with all the people that supported us in making this happen.
We've had a lot of incredible supports to make this happen. I think of Amy, Philco, Rumsha, Don from Leiden University and their team. I think of
Amy and Jeff on your end.
Jeff on our end. We think of the Dallaire Institute and their time, Jessica, Shelley, a variety of people on there that have made it. Yeah, Catherine. And then our institutions, I think of the president of the university or the dean here, Bill Flanagan, Tammy Hopper, who have been so supportive from our end, and then from your end with the rector.
Esther Bell, who was very willing to open it and read a beautiful text as a welcome text at the beginning.
Yeah. And then we've had other people who have been such an inspiration and kind of buoyed us as we were visioning forward, the students who have contributed, some who have visioned with us. Those are doing transcriptions as we say. So Jonathan Jin or Kyle Wyman or others who have supported, for example, the transcriptions that have gone forward. Fabulous to have their support as well. Those who have, with Jeff Allen and his team, and there have been so many from his side that have worked behind the scenes to give that professional touch. So much to be grateful for.
Absolutely.
To enable the message to come forward. I so look forward and I'm grateful that it's going to be up and accessible, available for days, years to come.
Yep, me too.
Yeah. Eric, thank you for making this such a possibility. It was basing everything on Cleveringa. It really grounded us in terms of moral courage, and the opportunity, just the brilliance of Leiden University, having held so much esteem for a professor who upheld and exemplified moral courage, and celebrating that and using that Cleveringa professorship to really keep a compass for our society, really, as a university without borders from Leiden University, to help reorient us continually to the importance of that going forward, and how privileged it is for us to, with Romeo Dallaire, being born in Holland and being Dutch and then also being Canadian, so being both a celebrated Canadian and otherwise, that we have this connection. I wouldn't mind if you could just share a little bit of the inspiration of Cleveringa and why this is so important.
Yeah, well, Cleveringa stood up when the Germans invaded our country to not let the academic voice be taken away. And he went against that force, and he stood up, and that later became embodied or personalized as moral courage for what he did in those first years of the occupation of the Germans. And the university acknowledged that by giving a professorship to everybody who has later expressed this moral courage as the Cleveringa professorship. That is a high award at the University of Leiden. And actually in 2020, it was the 50th Cleveringa chair that was awarded to Romeo Dallaire. 50 is a memorable year, and it represents something that is very precious at Leiden University. The way I became to know the Leiden University is that these standards, moral standards, are very important to preserve, to respect, and to honor. So I think Romeo Dallaire has done a wonderful job to be represented as a leader, a military leader, and a Canadian citizen, and United Nations representative for many years, and a member of the Senate in Canada. That deserves to be honored that way. That we could do that for him.
Yeah, it's such an incredible award. You know, I also think about him in his military role as a leader, and today you sit here wearing your military uniform, and I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise as a psychiatrist, as a thought leader, as a researcher, also in uniform with us, bearing that. Reminding us of the importance of leadership, not only in the field, but also in service within the healthcare world. I wouldn't mind you just sharing a few words about the importance of what the uniform means to you.
Well, you know, in my military career, I came across this documentary, "Shaking Hands with the Devil," and it meant a lot to me to learn that a 1-star, a 2-star general could suffer from the same effects of being exposed to catastrophe and mass trauma, the way that soldiers did, and that a general can stand up and speak out and destigmatize PTSD. That was so powerful, so important. And I saw in that video 3 Canadian soldiers talking about how much they were haunted and suffered from PTSD. And then there was the general opening up the way for all the soldiers to also speak up. And that destigmatization was so powerful, I think, for the Canadian Armed Forces, but it did also service for the others. And I think it was 1996 or 97. That was a couple of years after the mass tragedy in Srebrenica, where also many soldiers could shove it up and shove it under the carpet, or speak up, because you can't keep it under the door, behind the curtains or under the drawer. You can't. So that was important for myself as a human individual, as a professional, and to empower the individuals to help them to overcome that stigma. And it was important for me to empower affected individuals to not let themselves be eaten up by the trauma that was haunting them, and to give them their voice back.
Yeah, just being consumed. You've been doing you mentioned Srebrenica, and just thinking about some of the work that you've been doing there to help people recover or repair. Could you describe that a little bit to us?
Well, you know what is so fascinating about something like post-traumatic stress disorder? It doesn't come up immediately after trauma. It can take some time. There can be years of cognitive avoidance where you're trying to make the best and trying to work harder, trying to drink maybe a little bit more, and the idea like, well, that's a good strategy to catch some sleep. But you can't. So you got to work it through. You got to process that trauma if it is eating you up, or it's is haunting you under your skin. And what we're learning to do is exposure therapy is really helpful for this. And exposure therapy in the offices can do only so much. But if you can in vivo exposure in that immersified context, and we're trying to do everything we can with virtual reality to bring it closer, to go under the soul, under the skin, or even go to the site of your former deployment if it's safe to go back to Srebrenica, or go back to the former Bosnia and stand there with your fellow soldiers, with your buddies, remembering what had happened there, and to remembering to give the voice back to the voice that was sort of stolen or frozen into your mind. And that's something that I've learned so much from the years in my professional career, to give them their voice back, to empower them to speak. And if they don't have a voice or don't speak about it, it's going to lead its own life, and it's going to haunt you in your nightmares. So to do everything we can to put words, and to even make music, or to dance, or to whatever, it can be helpful to work through those traumatic memories. That is something that has motivated me, and to see what light there is at the end of that tunnel is really an important message to articulate.
I agree. You've been doing some incredible exploration of different kinds of interventions to be able to help people recover back with a mission, return with a mission. Been doing things with Re-MDR, blazing ways to try and help people recover, work with psychedelics to be able to help people overcome trauma, or MDMA to help people deal with forgiveness, and maybe be able to be supported in overcoming blocks, internal blocks. I find that very inspiring, Eric, in terms of some of the ways that you've been visioning forward, moving things outside of the norm to find other interventions when our evidence-based interventions don't work as well for some of our.
Well, Suzette, if we review the literature, and we're very critical on the evidence-based intervention, we see that for the military and other uniformed professionals, these evidence-based interventions do not work well enough. We know that we need to take that at heart, and we need to do better as a professional organization of mental health workers, and look outside of the box. And then we need to maybe unconventional therapies at first sight, unconventional. And for some people, horse therapy is unconventional, but for some it is really helping them. For some, it's psychedelics. It's weird, okay, but maybe for some it's the light that they've never been able to connect with, them with lost parts of themselves. And for others, it's virtual reality and technological interventions. And it's not one size fits all. It's what we need to learn, what works for who at what condition. And a 20-year-old needs another form maybe of therapy or intervention than a 40-year-old, or somebody who's single versus somebody who's married, somebody who's a father versus somebody who's not yet a father. So I think those are things that's really a personalized medicine.
Personalized, and it also sounds like it's a continuum of different kinds of offerings, that some things may work for someone at a certain point. We might try some conventional things, some more traditional evidence-based interventions, and then if there's a block, we might try something that's more personalized to maybe help someone get over onto another phase of their journey.
But I think you've learned that as well in your professional career, absolutely, where elements are really important in that domain, right? When I hear you talk about forgiveness and self-forgiveness as concepts that reach towards a domain that is sort of a spiritual domain, I think you can speak to how important that may be for somebody who's suffering from PTSD or moral injury, right? Mm-hmm. Could you speak to that a little bit?
I think, I celebrate the times that we've had a chance to talk more broadly and integrate the mental health expertise that you have, that I bring clinically, and then also that integration of the spiritual domain into it, where we look at the really attachments, the relationships, the meaning and purpose that someone has, and the value of the connections that we have with ourselves, with other people, with the divine or the transcendent, and how when we're in these spots of moral distress and our values and beliefs may be compromised due to what people are exposed to, or have made choices, acts of omission, acts of commission, that can injure the very self, the very core, the very soul, the very heart of the person. And we need some way to actually repair those relationships. And so what we found, and it has been known from many, many different cultures and perspectives over the course of human history, is there needs to be an opportunity to repair and remember people back into communities. I think that brings us not just to what therapeutically works for an individual, but also how we help that individual reconnect with those that are important and become part of the community again, back part of the body again. And so forgiveness, having some self-awareness, also having opportunities, different practices or rituals that people may go through to be able to help them reconcile, name, identify, have some awareness, be able to do something, engage in something that enables them to bring some closure, and then importantly, to have some opportunity for meaning making after those rituals that people may engage in, be that burning a candle, be that burning something that's on a piece of paper that someone needs to forgive themselves for, and releasing it, letting go, and then having an opportunity to make some amends within oneself and turn again to the way that one chooses to live differently again. And then to do that in a group. Sorry, Eric.
No, I was listening to you, but I was already lining up to give you a comment on what you just said.
No, please, by all means.
No, what you just said, what I also learned in some of the panelists that contributed in this webinar series, especially from the indigenous people, that there's also phases in the processing of these horrific events, and there needs to be maybe an expression of anger in this sort of the first phase or so, and then the second phase maybe disclosure. No, well, that maybe go in hand, the anger with the disclosure of what had happened. Before that then can be something like forgiveness or reconciliation. They cannot go in reverse order. They have to be respected in a way. And I felt that also in the military, sometimes there's acting out that needs to precede the forgiveness and the self-forgiveness. And even 25 years after Srebrenica, there's many of these soldiers that cannot forgive themselves, and they don't know what to do to self-forgive. So tools need to be given to them. Is how do you do something like that? And we can call, say, spiritual, but what is that, and how do you operationalize that? These are questions that are really important to give flesh to soldiers. Help me to execute, quote unquote, execute this, or operationalize, I should say, self-forgiveness for the fact that I have not been able to prevent what happened there.
I think that's where we have some cues from different cultures and different spiritual, religious, philosophical traditions, where we can look at how different peoples have worked through those processes of when there's been a breach of a relationship, when there's been something that someone has done willfully or chosen to do, chosen not to do, that has compromised themselves and compromised others. And how does that mending happen? So we see sweat lodges, we see the confessional within different Christian faith traditions. We see different exchanges between people, or even people who had gone to war historically, having been pulled away from the community for a period of time, where they could reflect on what they had done on behalf of the community, but having gone to war and coming back after a purification experience of one form or another before they could be reconnected with the community. So that there is a recognition, has long been a recognition, that there needs to be a time for reflection, repair, and then a new shedding of that old way and a reconnecting with a new way going forward. So I think there's lots to learn. We have much to translate too for people who might not be familiar with those kinds of practices.
I agree with you. And it's funny that, funny may not be the right word, is that we're sharing. This is what we are doing, like entertaining a conversation where we listen to each other, respectful of each other's opinions, voices, and trying to make sense out of observations that we share, and reflective observations about the behavior of ourselves and others to learn.
Absolutely. I think it was beautiful as we went through the whole critical conversation series, just seeing how some common threads were spoken by a variety of our different panelists and moderators in and through each of the different sessions. It's so wonderful to think about and reflect on all the incredible people who joined us on the journey.
Should we go session by session to briefly highlight the important people that were there?
I would love to.
Yeah.
If I start with session one, we spoke about moral leadership and courage from different perspectives. And as a moderator, we had with us that day Dr. Shelley Whitman from the Dallaire Institute. We also had a number of speakers, so certainly General Retired Romeo Dallaire was with us. We started off the sessions, though, if you wouldn't mind speaking to it with the rector.
Right, Hester Bell and Bill Flanagan from your university, Bill Flanagan, and from my university, it was Hester Bell who opened the Critical Conversation series with welcoming remarks. And I remember also Hester Bell who called to the university in a way that actually the moral courage was embodied by the university as something that was taken really at heart. So that stood out really as an opening series of remarks, and the same for Bill Flanagan, who echoed that. Mm-hmm. After which we could then engage in a conversation with Michel Cicquanini and a good friend of General Romeo Dallaire, Patrick Camard, who's a hero in the Netherlands, and hero is maybe an odd word here, but is very respected for the times that he served. As a sort of a supporter or the right hand of Kofi Annan at the time of the United Nations. That was a great opening series, very well attended by people in many countries. Attended that opening series.
Mm-hmm. Michael Cicquanini in that conversation also offered some incredible thoughts about where he had gotten his moral compass from. And the inspiration he had from the role model of his upbringing with his father, and we heard about moral compass, and the rooting of that, and how there's good leaders and others who may make other choices that can have impacts on children, on families, on peoples that they serve. So a real call to action that way, but an inspiration forward to support the upcoming generations.
And then to go to the second session was where we had international leaders that discussed the cost of moral courage with questions like, how do leaders in the face of grief, loss, and adversity cope with these situations? And how do they preserve their role as a leader when they were confronted with the horrors of children being recruited and used as soldiers? Young people that were encouraged to develop leadership skills. And it was also important to tell them how to lead despite adversity and prepare them for things that could go wrong, these young children. And we had a wonderful set of presenters, Suzette, with from my country and my university, Leiden University, who had former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bert Koenders, and retired Captain Ken Hofer, from the Canadian Armed Forces, and we had Dear Carberry from the Irish Dear Carberry, who served as a representative of the United Nations.
Yeah, and we had the moderator, Dr. Alice Aiken, who had been the founder of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veterans Health Research, and certainly has been very well known in the area of military and veteran research. So Dr. Alice Aikens ended up facilitating the conversation quite richly as we circled around that cost of leadership, the moral courage that's required in the face of different challenges on the global context, because that really brought in a global perspective into that conversation.
In the third webinar series on the 30th of September, we spoke about the ethical decision making and moral dilemmas, and that was a session that it was very memorable because it coincided with the Truth and Reconciliation Day. That was the first day in Canadian history for the Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. We had a number of special guests that day. We had Elder Betty Latendre and Shannon Cornelson who were with us. Who were speaking to us a little bit of giving us a window into the experience of residential schools and and the impact on the community. We heard a little bit later from a number of our speakers, including Dr. Delia Pikachu. We heard from General Retired Peter Van Oom, Virginia Gamba, and then we heard from Professor Niels Blocker. Anything stand out for you specifically that was moderated by Dr. Greg Zubach that day as well?
Well, Greg Zubach really laid out in his opening speech this term that was coined over and over in the whole series about the moral compass. Where did you get it from, and how was your moral compass affected by your professional career? And one of the touching, and I knew this story from Peter Van Oom when he was affected, when he lost his son on the battlefield the day he was promoted, and how he coped with that. And he shared that story with the audience at large, and how he kept his moral compass. That was a very touching moment. Because the sharing that he did, and also the reflective capacity that he's brought to us in reflecting on that in how many years was it? 2008, I think it was. So that's 13 years later. But the same end, I remember Niels Blocker, where there was in his leadership role, somebody at the British representative couldn't cope with a decision, a political decision that was made, and resigned because it felt it was outside of her moral compass. And Niels Blocker himself was not affected by that. So how do you relate to these difficult compasses, I should say, and somebody's affected by it, and the other person is relatively unaffected by it? So what lessons can you take from that in order to prepare leaders for making ethical, difficult, morally challenging decisions?
Yeah, it was a rich conversation. It was certainly the moral compass that we heard from each of the speakers and their personal lives, be that as Delio Pikachu as an adjudicator within the residential school system, and otherwise leaning into her upbringing, originally from the reserves in Saskatchewan, and then also from our other speakers, Virginia Gamba offering a UN perspective.
Yeah. For children in armed conflict.
Exactly.
And it was an honor for us to have her with us in that panel. Absolutely.
And really shining a light on how this is a global issue, that these aren't issues that are just close to home in one area or another, but that they really have far-reaching implications, and not just for one generation, but for multiple generations, and the intentionality that we need to make as a people for global peace.
And just wanted to echo again, Shannon Cornelson, who was with us on that session, who we met just a couple of months before, and she touched our hearts, and how she was a brilliance to share a very, very tough story and difficult story, personally for her, but also for Canadian citizens at large, for the intergenerational trauma that was, as you just said a minute ago, by the residential school survivors. So we were really honored to have her with us and to share her 3-minute story in a 3-minute clip, so to speak, on how it affected her and at Fort Edmonton that she's conveying to many of the visitors there.
Yeah, and beautiful too to end that day with remembering the blessing that Elder Betty started off the day with, and then the closing song that we ended off with, so that we could vision forward and have hope for the future.
Let's go to session number 4, Suzette.
Yeah, session
that was on the 13th of October, on moral injury and intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, we had some.
We looked at how moral injury can impact the society at large, and we were looking at intergenerational trauma and the intergenerational impact of trauma on individuals, on their families, and on their communities. Mm-hmm. And we also looked at the biology, how that could contribute to the understanding how important it was, or how overvalued or undervalued it was in that context of intergenerational trauma, and how it could be impacting child soldiers, combat veterans, Holocaust survivors, for example? We had a wonderful set of panelists that touched on these topics.
Yeah, from Professor Dr. Rachel Yehuda. We had Professor Dr. Gerlinda Metz, Dr. Shelley Whitman engaged in that conversation, Dr. Benya Mesmer, and then we had Professor Dr. Andy Greenshaw moderating that session. So bringing forward to the fore in an integrated way in all of those conversations, key topics that you just raised.
You know, what stood out as one element that I just wanted to bring to the table now is what Benya Mesmer said about accountability from a legal perspective. When is a child accountable? From an international legal perspective, is it at age 12 or 14 or 16? And what biology needs to be fed into that discussion to motivate decision makers to put that threshold on whatever age it is, 12, 14, or 16, or later. So that interwoven discourse about who feeds into what discourse and what sets the standard was something that he beautifully articulated in that session. And it was sort of backed up by Rachel Yehuda and a moderator who exchanged some of these ideas. How important is one domain versus another domain that led to a couple of interesting perspectives that were shared.
Definitely. I think the other piece that kind of stood out for me was the importance of society and how much society plays a role in setting the context, providing the appropriate supports and services, and shaping people, helping them heal, helping them recover, setting the context. So a rich conversation.
Yeah. So then if we go to session number, where are we now? Session number 5?
Yeah.
It's the repair of moral injury.
That was a rich conversation that Dr. Alexander Heeper, chief psychiatrist from Veterans Affairs, moderated with a very strong panel of Dr. Jackie June DeHinder, Dr. Captain Retired William Nash, Dr. Joseph Currier, Dr. Ptsd Berai. It was a fascinating reflection on how moral injury impacts people, and then the way that, again, we heard again how the social construct, attachment, repair, helping people remember with themselves and with the community, to be able to overcome some of the challenges that arise with moral injury, to be able to recover.
I think it was Jackie June Terheide, or maybe it was William Nash, that also looked at moral injury from a children's perspective. And we often think that it is something that is sort of reserved for adults, but it is something that children can also be severely affected by. And we don't really know much about the guilt and the shame in children. So that was something that needs to be further explored and understood.
Absolutely. Same with empathy. Empathy as a way to help connect and understand and repair. Lots of thoughtful reflection and a very deep reflections by people as they were.
Well, it's an important topic because sometimes, and I speak for myself, I ask students, what is the half-life of PTSD? And we don't know, and is moral injury the next one on the rise? And what is really moral injury? So these panelists really helped articulate to have a discourse on moral injury. You know, where the discourse comes from, and for instance, who owns the field of moral injury? Is it mental health, or is it chaplains who are better served with a discourse that does give food to the ingredients of moral injury?
It really circled around where the domain lies and the importance of it as a human experience. That this is something that has multi-prongs and different kinds of expressions and requires a diverse approach in order to be able to help people recover. And it really is that question about, is this part of human experience, or is it something that ought to be a medical condition, for example, included in the DSM-5, or how do we address it? How do we face it? And what does it take as a people, from professional perspectives, various multidisciplinary perspectives, to be able to help people along their way?
And I remember Bill Nash, who now is working within the United Nations in the role of the PTSD framework, where moral injury also is something that needs to be recognized. And he's working really hard to convey that message, and the sort of delayed type of PTSD, and that is maybe captured by the engine, the driver that is this moral injury, that is this guilt and shame, that is a driver for the chronicity. And I think that he addresses this extremely well in his. He addressed it also extremely well in his contribution to the panel.
Absolutely. We had the follow-up talk that we had on October 27th was really wonderful on the heels of that conversation, looking at destigmatizing the impact of trauma and PTSD. And again, a strong panel, yourself as moderator, which was wonderful to see you in that role. And then we had a number of other close colleagues of yours, if you wouldn't mind speaking to them.
Yeah, we looked at the impact of stigma and trauma and PTSD, and this is a difficult topic in the military, and we often think that we overcame the stigma, but it's still a discourse that is there. And yeah, it was an honor for me to be able to serve as a moderator and have dear colleagues and friends that walked long paths together. Bob Ursano, Robert Ursano, the retired colonel, Professor Bob Ursano, the retired colonel, dear friend Rakesh Jetli from the Canadian Armed Forces, and Najat Maala-Majid from the United Nations, who was a spokesperson for fighting against child soldiers. There was a big banner behind her that echoed, like, we need to stop using child soldiers. But also was wonderful to see a dear friend, colleague, who's been a role model in my professional career, Professor Sandy McFarlane, who couldn't be with us live, but was with us through a video, 2 videos, where he put on the table what his view was on stigma and PTSD.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting with the stigma conversation, reflecting on self-stigma and the barrier that self-stigma can be for people actually being able to recover, and how that can be an impediment so much. In fact, more the self-stigma than sometimes can be the stigma that is projected in society or within other circles, or Bob Ursano's 3x3 matrix of stigma that kind of popped up. That was fascinating to watch him discuss that in terms of, the first of the 3 being the self or culture, or the spiritual elements, and looking at the weaving together of that, or the components that look at the experience of stigma, or the sense of sadness that comes, or the individual cultural and system level. So he presented this interesting matrix that for us to be able to look at.
What highlights, and this is often what happens in a webinar and in a conversation like this, at least that's what I also take, these little things. Do you remember what he said about the elevator?
No, remind me.
When you go into the elevator, you have 3 floors or 5 floors to engage in a conversation. That relational aspect, say hi, or make a connection, just say something to the other, and that make that connection was the way that he can convey it much better than I can do it. So I would encourage the listeners to rewind and go to that specific part of the conversation. Say, what the hell did he try to say there, and how important was that for the destigmatization of PTSD? Yeah. So typical some of these panelists, and they all have that capacity and have given highlights of beauty, where they were really at their best, articulating parts of that specific topic that was being addressed.
Absolutely. It was neat to see. Yeah, rich conversation again. Then we popped on to the 7th one. The 7th one was on leadership. We were looking at Re-Envisioning Leadership on October 28th, where we had Dr. Lorraine Smith McDonald, who was moderating that day. And we had a number of different key speakers, and I'm going to turn it to you to share the names of them, because they're
well, I was delighted to have my countryman
Yes.
Roxanne van Iperen be with us, a writer and a lawyer, a journalist, and she had just finished a book on Romeo Dallaire, The Genocide Facts, that was a bestseller in Dutch language in the Netherlands, and how these things can come about, that she was given the opportunity to be a panelist, and that matched beautifully to her passion of something that a person that she has been studying for over a year, and to listen to her eloquent speech and conversation in that leadership perspective that we had with this panel was beautiful, and she made a very nice set of very eloquent remarks on the systems perspective, the bystanders perspective. Mm-hmm. So that James met here, and Chelsea Jones, who gave a beautiful vignette about something that we could minimize as Winnie the Pooh. But the way that she wrapped it into her vision of leadership, and how Winnie the Pooh was a sort of a role model, as I understood it, for her, and these cartoons that she has come across in her upbringing, that were strong representatives of leaderships for her. So that was actually a beautiful conversation, how that unfolded.
Yeah, it was an interesting pivot too, between thinking about characteristics of a role model that, for example, Chelsea Jones left us with, in terms of being able to look at different role models within culture, within social media, within media itself, that exemplify those characteristics of a leader that one can learn and grow to embody. But then with James, just that pivot too, about what compromising leadership can do, and how damaging that can be, especially when children are involved, or for someone like himself, who had experienced leadership that was not uplifting, not empowering, in fact, quite the contrary, as in his life experience, that really was sobering, if I could use that word, the sobering realities of the difference between what the privilege of living in a life that is not exposed to war looks like, as opposed to those who have gone through such traumatic experiences at such a young age.
It was sort of being uplifted by one panelist who were sharing eloquent remarks, and then being sort of back on the feet on the ground when he said, "I was eating bullets for breakfast," where these leaders were his upbringing, and that was really touching, how he grew up in that leadership perspective.
Exactly.
And sobering.
Very sobering. I think the opening remarks too that Lorraine Smith McDonald left us with, in terms of just reflecting on what leadership actually is, what's involved in it. Very impactful kinds of comments. Again, worth listening to, revisiting. And then we had
and you don't forget yourself, Suzette, because I remember that you were in that session, one of the panelists. And how was it for you to be a panelist on that session, if I may ask?
It was certainly a different role, being within the conversation in a different way. I think it was rich to be able to engage with the panelists and hear their ideas, and build on the ideas together, really circling around with General Dallaire's comments about how what they were talking about from a leadership perspective really reflected humanity, embracing humanity, and circling back on what does engaged leadership mean. And then finally the culture change aspect, transformative culture change. So just being attentive to what they were bringing forward, and thinking about how all of those things reflected in an integrated way with the key tenets that the general had talked about, especially around moral courage.
It sounds so simple, and you again underscore these three critical elements that again you highlighted also in your contribution. engaged leadership, embracing humanity, and transformative culture change were sort of the key messages that were interspersed into many of the webinars.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it was beautiful, and then I think we saw that circle back all the more in the 8th session when we started talking about the pathway forward, and we're really privileged to have a few key people with us that day. And we had the addition of Anthony DiCarlo, who is with us as a co-moderator that day from the Dallaire Institute, sharing his experience in uniform. And then we had Dr. Ton Leifart as moderator, and a number of key speakers. So we had General Retired Romeo Dallaire and also the Honorable Marie Sinclair, Senator Sinclair. We had Dr. Stephanie Belanger from CIMBAR, the Canadian Institute for Military and Veterans Health Research. We had Professor Dr. James Orbinski, Colonel Gerard, who joined us as well. And wouldn't mind you just speaking to a little bit about the place and the importance of each of those people, because it was a stacked panel.
Yeah, it was a rich. Again, we keep saying that, but it is also out of respect and the contributions that were given. Just Gerard van Kuik was there, and he shared with us, of course, his upbringing and his parents, as was so important for General Dallaire. But what he didn't share, and he shared in the aftermath, and I have the opportunity to share that with you now here, is when he was on deployment, and one of his colleagues was killed by a tragical incident, and she wasn't killed by enemy fire, but by a tragical incident. He was stuck with the fact this was hostile environment, and what do you do with if a soldier is killed on the battlefield? Where do you leave the body? If you leave the body there, it's going to be picked up by the enemy, and you never may see it back again. And he discussed within himself what he promised his colleagues: we are not going to leave anyone behind. So legally, you cannot lift up a dead body and bring it back to a safe area. You cannot. And he felt that he morally needed to do that. That was the moral right decision, and that's what he did. And he got in quite some trouble for having done that. He didn't share that in his conversation at that time, but it's something that I'd like to share on behalf of him here, and he disclosed that later. And when I heard him say that story, and this was about 25 years later, I felt like, whoa, that is moral courage. This is moral courage. That the fact that a young officer does something against the mainstream for what he felt was right at that moment, and he deserved to be acknowledged for that. He didn't speak about that in his panel contribution, but I'm saying again for the second time that I felt I needed to echo his voice here. That was a beautiful contribution what he gave anyway on representing on Veterans Day a Dutch countryman of mine, mm-hmm. for the trajectory and the pathway forward. Mm-hmm. But the others were very memorable, and we had the honor of having Mary Sinclair, the senator, with us, who represented the indigenous Canadian people, and he shared a very poignant vignette about making a picture of children, and you've got to listen to it again for the message that he tried to convey in that little vignette, and how important it was how to articulate the loss of a child, and how to convey the importance, how much pain that represents. So beautifully how he used that vignette in his contributions, Suzette.
It really reflected and hit home the importance of that embracing humanity theme.
Yeah.
And the importance of respecting every human as human. Yeah. We heard too from Dr. James Orbinski some salient points about pathways forward, and again being able to make good decisions out of one's experience, and to stand up against the grain sometimes, to be able to know what one wants to build going forward, and to really apply oneself to do that, and the choices that we make. I think,
and maybe it's me that is very sensitive to this, but when he shared in the first couple of minutes to give the voice back of somebody who lost on the battlefield, together when he was there in Rwanda with General Romeo Dallaire, and that he, within his tears, could speak up and to share that with us. That's one of these rare occasions when it's the sensitivity of the issue and the emotion that is also articulated, and the emotion also sends a message, and he could contain that, but beautifully share with us how important it is to keep remembering. And this was Veterans Day, so it was important to remember this on Veterans Day.
mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to stress how touched I was, and I think many of us who shared that, and so was you, and I think everybody
Everyone was
listening into this.
Yeah, and then seeing Stephanie Belanger was an
Yeah,
absolute gift.
I'm so glad that we had her with us, Suzette.
Yeah, and she spoke some key ideas again, pathways forward, speaking from a higher level, but really challenging us to think about how we can make good choices going forward.
Yeah.
So,
and of course, the general was there with us. He was almost at every session for a few minutes or sometimes for longer. And this last session, he was with us for a long time. And I think he did so well trying to be there, being there, and sharing his observations, sometimes with an articulate tone, a sensitive tone, something with passion, most often with passion, sometimes with humor, and the joke, as we know him as well. It was great to be able to do that in the honor of his professorship.
Yeah, it would have been wonderful, and I think he would agree to have seen his professorship go on for a while longer.
For another year or two, or maybe 3, 4. But it ends on the 26th of November 2021, when there will be, this year from Leiden University, 2 professorships awarded to new candidates, and that ends his professorship this year.
Right, and he'll continue, I'm sure, to be the leader who he is and inspire others going forward. It'll be wonderful to hear him continue to reflect on post-traumatic stress disorder and also moral injury, but as he goes forward too on the growth that he's had in his life and the inspiration that he will be for so many more. He certainly continues to make those efforts to be transformative in his world and to set the context so that others don't go through some of the struggles that he's gone through as a leader, and to be really transformative in the culture change, and to have engaged leaders who can really be meaningful in there and intentional in the way that they lead towards a better, more peaceful world.
Hey, 2 more things, Suzette. One is there's going to be an ebook after the webinar series has ended now. We are going to ask all the panelists to contribute with either their transcript of their contribution, which they already have, or with an individual contribution about something they wish to share in an ebook that we will collect and collate and edit, and hopefully by spring be able to present to the general in if we may, with COVID, in a session where he's going to be present. And 2 is we have had student engagements that has served as a wonderful set of I wouldn't only say testimonials, but contribution and discussions that we have done a text analysis on, and that will be a contribution that we hopefully can disseminate in literature. One about leadership, and the other one is going to be about moral injury.
Moral injury, moral courage, moral repair. And,
yeah.
And we'll hear from some of the highlights from across all of the different discussions that we've had over this period of time between April and November. The threads and key ideas that have emerged. So some of the wisdom and nuggets that we've heard throughout this whole series. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you on this series. And we'll see what unfolds in days ahead and what other conversations will continue to unfold.
No less on my behalf here, Suzette. I remember the preparation that went into this, many hours, and we haven't met often, but it's as if you were sitting next to me, which was a delight that the last session we could actually watch the same screen together. But the ease in which we've been able to do this was wonderful, and maybe there's more to come.
You'll see. Certainly, there's a lot more to talk about. I look forward to it.
I was going to say, if there's going to be another Romeo Dallaire, we'll do another series.
Potentially. It might be that there's other people to celebrate and other lines of thought to continue to evolve and explore. Certainly lots of things that are emerging on the discussion front, be that different kinds of emerging therapies or interventions or ways that we might need to continue to support people as they reach their full potential, and if injuries happen, help them recover and find their way back.
Hey, just one last question, if I may then, Suzette. What stands out for you, if after some reflections that we've shared now, what stands out for you? What just pops into your memory as something you can share with us now, with me now?
I think the river and flow of wisdom and insight that weaved its way through the minds and hearts of students and the general and the moderators and panelists as we heard the twists and turns of the conversation. Some points of the conversation that flowed easily, some rocks and bumps in the road that made the conversations more delicate and showed the complexity of what we were actually speaking to. The highlight was the wisdom that was hidden, the gems that were hidden in between what insights each of the different panelists and speakers shared with us. But the commonality of the importance of the moral compass, I think, is what strikes me the most, and how I'm left with the question about how do we today help people embrace recognize their moral compass, embrace it, and be able to live true to it, and recognize what happens when it gets when it gets injured in whatever way, and how we can support people recovering, knowing how deeply impressed those that wound is, how much it takes to recognize a leader who has broken down the barriers that have impeded people from getting help, from recovering from trauma, and how important, how imperative it is that we find some real true solutions to help people so that their very lives can be meaningful again, and that we don't lose any more of those who serve and have served. What about you?
The one that I like to end with is probably the one that I think touched many students was when he spoke about love. He said, when I go to bed and I try to catch sleep, I've often been haunted by these nightmares. And recently I found again the love of my life. And when she touches me on my head, curls my hair, and I feel that love, I can let go. And it sounded so simple, but it touched everybody who was watching that. That man that just conveyed to us how he could not stand the loudness of silence, how he's had struggles and difficulties with suicidality, and how he's tried to act upon it, and how he's struggling with the inability to self-forgive. When he then talks about love, that is beyond. That's not a mental health issue. That is about transcendence and about spirituality in a way. That's an iffy discourse, and it sounds so incredibly simple, but so important. So how he shared with us is something that it leaves me also thinking how we can preserve that as a when you're talking about engaged leadership and embracing humanity. Love is a universal principle.
Absolutely. I think the importance and imperative of relationship and being seen and known and connected
Yeah.
with and loved
That's it.
without intention.
Yeah.
Or without strings attached, just being loved and seen for who one is and being embraced. And that probably as a society and as people's the most important thing we can give one another.
Yeah, it sounds so simple for somebody in military uniform to talk about love, but but it is. If you're wearing the uniform or not wearing the uniform, it is a relationship principle that is the heart of the matter.
Actually, I would posit that one puts on the uniform, not that I ever have, but because one cares about humanity and wants to see it thrive and wants to also protect it from anything that would get in its way. So, which is fundamentally protecting relationships that we have, country to country, person to person, another one. So I think it's actually the uniform exemplifies that in its goodness, in its richness, in its truth, and its focus and raison d'être for even wearing one.
Okay, a little bit of French.
Just a little. So all of those things. So it's been an absolute delight, Eric. Thank you for
Thank you too.
your journey.